welcome back. Today we're going to be covering infantry axes this time around, mainly the accessible ones. So all the 4-star ones, all the 3-star ones, all the Grail ones, and that's about it. I think the only one that we're leaving out is Summer Caspar, but that's about it, mainly because he's not that accessible, but oh well. He'll probably fit in somewhere along the way, even without giving an official rating. Even so, I'm ready to give my ratings on every accessible 3 and 4-star infantry axe. And before I start with that, I want to go over two things real quick. The performance rating and the cost rating. For anyone who isn't aware, I rank these units based on two factors. The performance rating, which is complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta, and the cost rating, which is basically how easy it is to invest into said unit on a minimalistic level. The cost rating is a bit more loose, simply because of the fact that most of these skills are going to be accessible, but at the same time I'm not going to rank them based on how many premium skills they need to function at their best, simply because of the fact that it will pretty much be the same score all around for most of the units, so I wanted to do something that's way more flexible. That's about it when it comes to the ratings, and with that pretty much out of the way, we may as well just get started with the first infantry axe, Arthur. Arthur is a Gen 1 unit that comes with a relatively mediocre stat line that can be bolstered by 20 flowers, but he also has a PRF that grants +8 to everything if both conditions are met, which is pretty easy to do considering that the first condition just requires him having some sort of visible buff, and then the second one having either a penalty or being below 100% HP, the latter being way more easy to fulfill. If you wanted to do something on budget, you could easily just give him Fury Desperation so it synergizes with his weapon. That with Arouse, so that way he can always have the +8 to everything ready to go. And in this example, he would have up to 62 attack and 43 speed before any other visible buffs are taken into account, so he'll actually become a pretty big stat haul. Likewise, if you want to go max invest with him, you could make him into a Spurn tank with Distant Pressure. Distant Pressure over Distant Dart will allow him to at least stay below 100% HP and give him +8 to everything consistently, even with Noontime active, because the chip damage activates after combat. And with that being said, I do feel like Arthur's definitely one of the more underrated demotes when it comes to axes. While not necessarily amazing, I don't think he's bad by any means. So I'm willing to give him a 6 out of 10 for his performance rating, simply because of the fact that, yeah, he can become a stat ball, which does allow him to catch up to modern axe infantries, but he doesn't really do much beyond that, which is why I'm not really going to go any higher. Next we have Balthus, who is an instant demote axe infantry unit with a relatively min-max stat line. He comes with instant axe for whatever reason, even though his speed isn't that high and the weapon is completely player phase, meaning he's pretty much never going to double in the player phase without any sort of investment. Even so, I would ultimately just ditch his weapon and then give him something entirely different so he can function better. If you want to do something on budget, quote-unquote budget, I feel like you could give him Spirited Axe with Ignis and Attack Defense Ideal 3. You could basically slap the Skahawk kit on him, minus Special Spiral. Special Spiral is definitely going to be a bit more expensive. However, I do feel like the synergy won't work otherwise without it. That being said, you could always swap out Ignis for Moonbow or a 2 cooldown special and then give him Quick Riposte, so that way he could always retaliate with a 2 cooldown special, if you really want to do something like that. Or if you want to go a bit more premium, you can actually keep the initial kit, except swap out Ideal for a distant counter skill, give him a joint drive, a solo, and then keep Spirited Axe or Huge Fan depending on your preference. I like Huge Fan mainly because of this giant funny fan, and he can function pretty well that way. I do find that his min-max nature is really good, simply for the fact that he's going to be taking a lot of hits, but I also fear that he's not going to be eating as many hits as he should be, simply because of the fact that modern day nukes are hitting way harder than they should be, just to counter saves, for example, which is why I'm going to give him a 5.5 out of 10 instead of a 6. I do feel that having the natural bulk is nice, but it's not going to do you any favors against units that are already hitting 70 plus attack, simply because of the fact that he does not have the bulk to deal with them, especially since he has lowish speed. Of course, you can invest into his speed, but I feel like it's not going to work out, especially if you're trying to keep his min-max nature. Next, we have Barst, who got a Fury Wrath Refine weapon, which is pretty cool, all things considered. He has a relatively okay offensive stat line, which can be bolstered with 20 flowers, so it's not the end of the world. His weapon also grants +4 to everything, which is pretty good. If you want to run something budget, you could always do double Fury, double Wrath, so that way he's hitting super hard once. And it's a bit different from Desperation, even though you could run Desperation. However, I kept that for the more premium build with Gale Force. So instead of refining Devil Axe for Wrath because Wrath won't work outside of the cooldown with Gale Force, I gave him a speed refine, and then I stacked Fury 4 with Desperation and Times Pulse. So that way he can always get Gale Force on the second hit with Flashing Blade. Of course, you're free to also just swap out his weapon entirely, but the +4 to everything could help in some aspects. Even so, I'm willing to give him a 5.5 out of 10. I feel like his stat line is just a bit outdated for my liking, so while he can always stack up stats with Double Fury and whatnot, I do feel that it's going to be a bit harder for him specifically to perform simply because of the fact that his stat line isn't up to date with modern infantry axes. Next we have Bartray, who has an armor effectiveness weapon with Fury 3 built into it. His stat line isn't exactly the best, but it can work for melee specialists. However, if you want to use him on budget, I would highly recommend not even refining his weapon, just keep the armor smasher, and then running attack defense ideal with quick riposte with steady breath, so that way he can always get a moonbow off, whether that's on the first or second hit, depending on whether or not there is a guard effect present. Even so, the idea here is just to stack up his attack and defense so he can eat a hit and then retaliate back with a heavy hit, whether that's with moonbow or glimmer. You can honestly make a preference for either. However, if you want to do a max invest build, honestly, I would recommend just making him into a support unit. Give him Sudden Panic with Green Dual Infantry, Double Drive Attack, and then Love Candelabra, and he can actually be a decent support unit. I feel like his performance as a combative unit isn't really going to be the greatest outside of just smashing armors. So you can always make him into an armor check, but I feel that Bartray isn't exactly the best when it comes to a lot of things outside of supportive skills with his HP stat. So I'm only willing to give him a 5 out of 10. Next we have Basilio, who is another infantry axe demote who doesn't come with a PRF of his own, but has a relatively decent stat line. He has 43 base attack with 33 speed. He has a good defense stat and lowish res stat, but the speed is more than workable. If you want to do something on budget, you can keep his base kit for the most part. You can keep Spirited Axe with attack defense bond, and then quick riposte if you want to make sure he doubles in the enemy phase. And this will at least allow him to get moonbows off consistently as well. And then if you want to do something a bit more premium, you can invest more into his speed stat by running Ninja Masakari and running a Flashing Blade Gale Force set with Times Pulse. This can actually allow him to output a significant amount of damage simply because of the fact that he's not really hindered down by his attack stat. It's really high, so just taking the speed boon isn't really going to hurt him in many aspects. And honestly, I'm willing to say that he gets a 6 out of 10 simply because of the fact that, yeah, he definitely has a more modern stat line, which is great. Also, due to the fact that his attack stat is way higher than most other Axe infantry units, he is able to be way more flexible with what he does. In terms of just whether he speed stacks, he's not really losing out on too much attack at that point. Or you can make him into a powerhouse melee specialist because his defense stat isn't bad by any means. Also, his cost rating is going to be relatively good because for the most part he's keeping his base kit. Next we have Young Boyd, who is our latest and greatest Axe infantry unit. He comes with a really funky PRF that basically grants him a bunch of stuff on odd turns and then attack speed 5 on even turns. As weird as that imbalance may be, it's still comparable to modern inheritables, which is pretty good. That on top of the fact that his stat line is really good offensively, he's not really going to struggle to deal damage whatsoever. If you want to do something on budget, I highly recommend just going with the Darting Breath Wrath set, so he can always keep himself healthy. That on top of running Attack Speed Oath, which is available on Ninja Shamir, and Attack Speed Ideal, which is available on Muriel, he should be able to output a lot of damage, and shouldn't struggle to double whatsoever, at least against lower merged foes. However, if you want to do something a bit more premium, you could go with Double Fury with Wrath and Times Pulse, so that way he's outputting a significant amount of damage every single turn. You could always wait for odd turns for his damage output to be even higher, but with Times Pulse and Wrath, he should be able to get instant glimmers every single turn, provided that he doesn't die in the enemy phase. But even so, I'm willing to give Boyd a 7 out of 10, simply because of the fact that his stat line is really good, his PRF is pretty competitive. I find that he does a really solid job at what he's supposed to do. Next we have Kalik, who is a bit more speedy in nature compared to Balthus, although he has a bit less attack. Even so, they're pretty comparable for the most part because they're pretty min-max at the end of the day. His inheritable weapon isn't really much to write home about. It's basically fierce stance. But if you want to do something with it, you could always just make him into a heavy hitter in the enemy phase. On budget, you can stack up his attack and defense and then give him steady breath so he's always retaliating with a noontime and keeping his quick riposte threshold active. Or on the more premium side, you could just make him into an overall tank with Dex Swabber and Joint Drive Attack and Distance Stance. He's going to get a lot of bulk this way, but similar to Balthus, his problems also stem from the fact that units are just hitting way too hard these days. So I'm also going to give him a similar rating of 5.5 out of 10. I find that Kalik is one of the more interesting units you can invest into on budget, especially with Reprisal Axe, because you can actually just stack up his attack and defense, and he shouldn't struggle to output damage whatsoever. Next we have Pirate Daros, who doesn't necessarily have a PRF, but has a really solid stat line of 36-32 speed with a really high defense stat of 37. He is the one who brought Dex Swabber into the game in that trend of lots of inheritable axes for a bunch of people to use. But I wouldn't write him off as a unit because he's not too bad at all. If you want to do something on budget, you can also make him a defense tank with Dex Swabber, Attack Defense Ideal, and Rouse Attack Defense 3 with Solo. This will allow him to trigger bonfire hits on every second hit, provided that the foe can double, and he shouldn't be taking too much damage anyway from melee foes, simply because of the fact that his defense stat is really high, especially with a defense refine. However, if you want to invest more into him, you can actually speed stack him, and he shouldn't struggle to also take hits from both melee and ranged foes, simply because of the fact that he's getting damage reduction. However, you will have to watch out for speedier foes, which is why rather than giving him something like Distant Dart, I gave him double Solo and then a Ruse, so that way he could stack up his speed even more. In many aspects, he's comparable to Basilio, which is why I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. His cost rating isn't actually too bad either because he's also maintaining a good amount of his base kit, but performance-wise he's pretty similar to Basilio simply because of the fact that their stat lines are pretty comparable. Next we have Echidna, who is one of the earlier book speedy axes that we had in the game. Her inheritable weapon wasn't exactly anything to write home about, but her stat line at the time was really good. If you want to try her out, honestly, you may as well just ditch her weapon entirely, give her Spirited Axe, run double Speed Wave, and then Wrath with Ideal, so that way she can always retaliate with a harder hitting noontime and keep her health really high. Her attack will be on the lower side as a result, but it shouldn't be too bad with, merges and whatnot, but just keep that in mind when you're using her. Speaking of which, you can pretty much just make her a Spurn tank, because at the end of the day, that's pretty much what she's really good at. You boost up her attack more than her speed with the boon, mainly because 34 base attack isn't bad by any means, but having more damage output isn't always a bad thing, especially when her speed stat is already really high. She's getting a speed refine from Dex Swabber, and you're only going to get diminishing returns with speed if you keep stacking it. But even so, she can act as a really solid tank overall with Spurn and Dex Swabber and Darting Breath. She really shouldn't struggle to output damage, but she will struggle against units that can bypass her damage reduction, such as Young Innis, Dual Lift, etc, etc. But she's pretty similar to a lot of other Spurn tanks, which is why I'm also going to give her a 6 out of 10 for her performance rating. Next we have Gonzalez, who has a stupid amount of HP with a good attack stat, a really good attack stat actually, with good speed, a decent defense stat, and low res. He's really comparable to a lot of other Axe infantries, especially Basilio, since they do share a similar stat line at the end of the day. His inheritable weapon is Rhine Axe, which is a weapon that inflicts speed defense -5 on foes within 2 spaces, which isn't bad offensively whatsoever. If you want to take advantage of it, you can either run it supportively, or, in my opinion, you may as well just run it as a Fury Desperation set with Flashing Blade, so that way he can output damage consistently while minimizing the amount of retaliation damage he's taking. And even though he can take a single hit because his HP stat is really high, outside of that, he's probably not going to be taking too much hits without heavier investment. But on the heavier investment side, I would highly recommend giving him a Shuriken Cleaver set with Gale Force, simply because of the fact that his damage output can be way higher with true damage from Flashing Blade and Shuriken Cleaver. That'll make him get 9 points of extra damage before Blade Session comes into effect, which will make Flashing Blade checks even easier to accomplish. Even so, I'm also going to give Gonzalez a 6 out of 10. He's still rather comparable to the likes of Basilio and others that either stack up their speed for Spurn tanking or have a relatively similar stat line. Next we have Ninja Hana, who was the original arena scoring bot before Ninja Shamir came into the game. She scores relatively well even still to this day, but obviously you may not want to use her for that purpose anymore simply because other units exist. But even so, she has a really solid offensive stat line with a workable defensive stat line. She comes with Ninja Masakari, which is basically just a speedy Brave Axe. If you want to use her with it, I highly recommend just stacking up Life and Death and running her with a Dancer with Hit and Run and Savage Blow so she can go in and go out with minimal issue. And if you want to invest more into her, I highly recommend just making her into a Sprint Tank with Distance Stance and Dex Swabber. A lot of her damage reduction is going to come from Spurn rather than her natural bulk, but that's perfectly fine because with Distance Stance and Speed Rest Solo, she can actually take a couple hits, and she's going to be really fast for a lot of foes, so it's going to be difficult for them to double anyway. I would say she's like the peak of 6 out of 10, simply because of the fact that she has a way more optimized stat line, she has the workable bulk, she has really good speed, but she doesn't really do much outside of that, because at the end of the day, she's rather generic. And now onto a more interesting unit, Hawkeye. Hawkeye's never really talked about too much, but I think that's for a relatively good reason. His stat line isn't really good. His bulk can actually become relatively decent if you invest into him, but he basically just has a Slaying Axe with low attack defense built into it, which is fine. It's not bad by any means. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well try and stack up his defense stat with Attack Defense Form and Steady Breath and Attack Smoke. Soul is going to be there so he can actually heal up a lot more and keep his Quick Riposte range active. But there's a good chance that he's going to be taking a lot of damage from the first hit, so there's a good chance that he'll probably fall out of the Quick Riposte range really easily. Of course, with max investment, you could always just make him into an overall tank. I find that his stat line isn't exactly the best overall when it comes to pretty much anything. He does get the flowers, which does help, but his attack stat's fine, but his bulk could always be better, especially against modern day units. I would say that Hawkeye, while definitely struggling in a lot of aspects, is pretty similar to Kalik in a good amount of ways, and Balthus, except even though they have better stat lines and overall stats, I would still say Hawkeye is rather comparable, and while definitely worse in many aspects, he still does the job okay enough. Next we have Hinata, who is basically another Bartray in a sense. He has really high HP, he has good attack and good defense, with low res and low speed. And he comes with Huge Fan, which is basically the Mistletoe effect, which basically grants accelerated cooldown per foe's hit if the unit has a bonus active, which isn't bad by any means. If you want to use him on budget, you could keep his base kit with Attack Defense Oath and Quick Riposte, stack up Attack Defense Bond, and he should be outputting a good amount of damage and taking a lot of defense targeting hits. Of course, on max investment, you can make him a melee specialist with Huge Fan and get Aether going on every second hit with Quick Riposte. He shouldn't struggle to take any sort of defense hit whatsoever because his defense stat is really high, but he is going to get doubled quite often from a lot of units if you don't speed invest into him, which you can, but I think you may as well just prioritize his better stats, since he doesn't really gain all too much from stacking speed outside of just preventing natural doubles. Even so, he is, at the end of the day, still rather comparable to Bartray, so I am going to give him a 5 out of 10. Even though he's a bit more optimized than Bartray, they're fairly similar in terms of stats, so I don't really feel comfortable giving him any higher or lower of a score. Next we have Legion, who honestly is a really solid axe unit overall. His offensive stat line is pretty good, but he has basically no bulk whatsoever. His weapon though carries him really well. He has built-in Panic Smoke that works during combat and after combat, meaning you cannot buff against him whatsoever. And then on a special refund, he gets attack speed +5 and unconditional Heavy Blade, which makes his offensive prowess even stronger. Honestly, on budget, you may as well just go with the Fury Desperation route with Brazen, because he should be able to trigger Moonbow or any 2 cooldown special on every second hit because of his PRF, which is really nice, all things considered, especially on budget. Of course, if you want to do something a bit more premium, you can make him a Spurn Tank to make up for his lowish bulk, which can work. The idea here with Aether is that he's basically going to charge it on every second hit that he retaliates with, And then on the player phase on the next turn, he can retaliate with a full-blown Aether, meaning that he can heal up a majority of his HP, which is pretty nice. Honestly, I find that Legion can be pretty scary in modes like Arena simply because of the fact that whole mode emphasizes a lot of visible buffs, so units like Aversa and Legion will pretty much succeed there. But the fact that you don't even need to inflict panic to get his effect off means that he's going to be really, really strong offensively and even defensively, which is why I'm going to give him a 7 out of 10 for his performance. I find that he's definitely one of the better Axe, Infantry, Grail investments that you can invest into, albeit a bit outdated in many aspects, but still really, really strong. Next we have Libra, who has a relatively decent stat line. He has 35 attack with 32 speed. His mixed bulk could be better, but it's not bad by any means. His weapon inflicts -8 attack, speed, and defense, which basically grants him plus Spectrum 8, which is pretty good. He also gets true damage on every single hit for 7 damage, and he heals himself for 7 HP after every combat, which is pretty nice for sustainability. If you want to run him on budget, I was having a bit of trouble actually thinking of a good budget set because he can't really run Fury. Well, he can, but he won't get the healing. But you can actually make him an enemy phase unit with steady posture and speed smoke because his weapon does work if he is within 2 spaces of an ally. So if you give him double Mystic boost, then he can actually maintain his health relatively well. And the speed set is actually deceptively high because of the fact that his weapon essentially grants him +8 to everything, so he's not bad at all as an enemy phase unit. In fact, if you want to capitalize on that, you can give him attack speed unity with Spurn and Joint Drive attack and attack speed form. You don't even need to run something like Mystic Boost and the Sacred Seal for that because he does get a bunch more. He does get the healing from his weapon, so you can capitalize more on his attack and speed and keep his sustainability really high, which is really nice. That's why I'm going to give him a 6.5 out of 10. I do find that his performance is really good. In fact, he's pretty similar to Arthur in a lot of cases because of his PRF granting basically +8 to everything. But outside of the Mystic Boost and the true damage, he's not really much different from him. Even so, I'm willing to give him a 0.5 above Arthur. Next we have Lithis, who's basically Ninja Hannah with a defense stat. They don't really have too many differences, but the only big difference that was, at least at the time, was that Lithis could not score 180 BST because he had no super boons, which was really weird on Ias's part, but oh well, what can you do? He has Hausman's Axe, which inflicts -4 to everything on the foe during combat if he initiates combat, which isn't the worst if you want to be more player phase oriented with something like Fury Desperation, which you can do. You could always ditch it though if you want to make him into a melee specialist, but if you want to keep his Hausman's Axe, then I would highly recommend running a kit that synergizes with the player phase more. And Fury Desperation on budget isn't a bad thing whatsoever. Of course, if you want to do something more interesting, you could keep his weapon and run Sturdy Impact with Flashing Blade, so that way he could get Bonfire procs off every second hit, as long as he doubles, of course, which he shouldn't struggle to do because he's getting 53 effective speed before Rouse Speed Defense, which is great, actually. He shouldn't struggle to double whatsoever. And Sturdy Impact is there so he can at least eat a hit from a melee foe and then retaliate with a heavier hitting Bonfire. He will be more prone in the enemy phase, but at least with Spurn, he shouldn't struggle to take damage whatsoever. But even so, he's still another Ninja Hana, so I'm willing to just give him a 6 out of 10. Not really much different, especially Ninja Shamir, who's basically the same unit with like 1 extra point of stats, but that's about it. They're not too much different. If you like Lithis or you like Ninja Hana and you can't really decide between the two, they're really not too different, so go at it. Next we have Linus, who's actually not a bad unit whatsoever. His base effect is basically just the initial Basilicos Refine, minus the stat penalty. He gets Slang with attack speed 5, and then for his special Refine, he basically has Sparking Tome for speed and defense, which basically just inflicts penalties on the foe's speed and defense during combat, equal to ×2 the amount, so that way if you're buffing against him for speed and defense, it'll get reversed to penalties. And he's still getting essentially +10 attack and speed from his weapon at base. If you want to do something on budget, you may as well just keep his base kit with Desperation and Speed Smoke so he can consistently double, and he can eat a hit, which is why I'm running Double Brazen instead. So it shouldn't be too bad, especially with Fang Basilicos. He'll get a healthy amount of attack and speed, from his skills and weapon. But if you want to run something way more premium, you can honestly run him as a hit and run Gale Force unit with Heavy Blade and no follow-up. His attack is really high, so he shouldn't struggle to make attack checks, but you could also run Flashing Blade checks since those will always be easier. Attack is always on the rise, while speed is definitely fluctuating in terms of like low and highs depending on the unit. But I find that the higher speed units are the ones that have less bulk anyway, so you can honestly go with either. He has no follow-up, so he can always have his natural doubles, and he also has even Tempest, so he can act as a really solid hit and run unit, get in, get out with relatively high movement. And honestly, I'm willing to give him a 7 out of 10, simply because of the fact that his performance is really, really good. Honestly, I don't really have any complaints with his refine or his performance whatsoever. I just find that he doesn't do anything outstanding in comparison to other units that allows him to be ranked higher, in my opinion. Next, we have Mustafa, who is basically another Bartray in a sense, with a bit higher res. He has 38 attack with 36 defense and 45 HP, and a weapon that honestly you could go without, but isn't too bad if you want to run him on budget. If you want to run him on budget, you can keep Barrier Axe, stack up his attack and defense, and run a defense refine, so at the very least he can take a one hit from a dragon if necessary, depending on the dragon of course, and then he could always retaliate with a bonfire in every second hit. You're basically turning him into a budget melee specialist. But if you are going to do that, you may as well just optimize it and remove his Barrier Axe and go for something different. However, if you want to do something a bit more on the premium side, you could give him a Sling Axe with a res refine and patch up his res stat with Distant Stance, or basically turn him into another Kalik or Hawkeye. I find that his stats are a bit better than Bartray's, which is why I'm willing to give him the 0.5 over him, but he's not really too much different from someone like Hawkeye or Kalik at the end of the day, which is why I'm not going to rank him any higher than the 5.5. Next we have Raven, who is still really good even to this day. His weapon isn't anything to write home about, but is still rather comparable to modern inheritables, especially with the slaying effect. He can actually stand out a bit more because there aren't slaying inheritables that grant extra stats beyond the refine, so it's not too bad. His stat line offensively isn't even bad either, with 34-35 attack speed, not even including the Resplendent stats, which bolsters it to 36-37. If you want to run him on budget, you can go double Life and Death with Fury, so he can at least potentially take one hit, and then he can basically output a significant amount of damage afterwards. However, if you want to go with something a bit more premium, you can make him into a Spurn tank with Vital Astra and Spurn and Time's Pulse. This can allow him to eat up a lot of damage overall and make up for his lower bulk, which isn't too bad anyway, even with the Resplendent and Flowers, of course. Even so, I would still say his performance is rather comparable to the likes of Linus, which is why I'm also going to give him a 7 out of 10. Both can pretty much run the same sets. The only difference is that Linus's performance is going to be a bit better simply because of the fact that his weapon also inflicts penalties to speed and defense, meaning that he can end up being a better Spurn tank and damage dealer, but it's not too bad anyway for Raven because at the end of the day, they are still rather comparable. Next we have Russ, who has a high HP stat with a good attack stat and a workable speed stat. Also a workable defense stat. Not much else though. He also comes with a Brave Axe, which is perfectly fine, especially since his attack stat is really high. You don't really have to worry about his lack of damage output, especially with double Death Blow and Moonbow and Chill Defense. You can also run Savage Blow if you want to make sure he's getting kills on other foes that are adjacent to the one you were initially initiating combat on. His damage output shouldn't be too bad anyway because he does get 58 effective attack before Shield Defense is active or like any visible buff, so it's not too bad on budget. However, if you want to do something a bit more premium, you can honestly make him into a hit and run unit, speed stack him with Springy Axe with Sparrow 3, hit and run and Odd Tempest. The idea here is mainly just to take advantage of the 3 movement and Gale Force so he can go in, attack, kill, and then get out as quickly as possible. And he doesn't really have to worry about not taking an attack boon simply because of the fact that his 38 base is really, really high anyway. But at the end of the day, he's still rather comparable to the likes of Echidna, even though his speed stat is a bit lower. Basically, they have swapped attack for swapped speed at max investment anyway, so I find that they're not really going to be ranked all too differently. Next, we have Ninja Shamir, who's basically just Ninja Hana. I don't really feel like I need to cover her all too much, simply because of the fact that they're basically the same unit. They have basically the same stat line, basically the same inheritable weapon, except rather than getting speed, you get true damage, and that's really it. If you want to run a budget set, you can pretty much do the same thing as the Ninja Hana set with double life and death, hit and run, savage blow. This is again just so you can get in and get out with a dancer and make sure that her damage output is still relatively high. And then on the more premium side, you could go with Shuriken Cleaver and Gale Force. It's also a similar set I put on other units with Flashing Blade, No Follow-Up, and Blade Session. Basically stack up her attack and speed. She can eat a hit, thankfully, because her mixed bulk isn't too bad at all. She can get 9 points of true damage from Shuriken Cleaver and Flashing Blade, which shouldn't be too hard to do, especially with Blade Session and invisible buffs. But she's still a 6 out of 10 for me, simply because of the fact that she's basically just Ninja Hana at the end of the day. Like, exactly like Ninja Hana, with like minimal differences, if any. And then finally, we have Summer Yilger, who is also fairly similar to Echidna. They have relatively the same attack and speed with pretty much decent mixed bulk. Her Shoreline Rake can actually be used for the melee specialist role if you want to keep that. The idea here is mainly so you can stack up her attack and defense with double waves. She already comes with even defense waves, so you don't really have to worry about foddering it to her. And then you can stack up her attack and defense with Shoreline Rank and attack defense ideal. Quick Riposte is there just so she can secure the double, because 36 speed may not be enough against higher merged units. You could also just make her into a Gale Force unit similar to Shamir, or you can make her into a mixed tank with Deck Swabber if you really want to do that. Her scoring isn't exactly the best anyway, but you can pretty much do the same thing as you did with either Ninja Shamir or Echidna, because at the end of the day, they're pretty similar, which is why I'm also going to give her a 6 out of 10. They don't really do anything much different. A lot of the Axe Infantries, without a PRF and similar stat lines, pretty much do the same thing, so it's hard to come up with newer and different builds every single time. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's pretty much it for the Axe Infantry units. I had a fun time looking through these because there were still a lot of them, especially compared to Sword Infantry. I believe the Sword Infantries had more anyway, but there were still a lot of axes to go through. Even so, I found it was interesting looking through each and every one of them. And my hope was that you took something out of this, because I certainly did. There are so many units in this game with similar stat lines that they can pretty much perform the same in a lot of regard, and that applies to a lot of the axes. Even so, if you're looking for a good merge project, you can't really go wrong with a lot of them, so you may as well pick favorites. But anyway, this was my Infantry Axes ranked video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you want to see more of these, make sure to like and subscribe, especially that latter part. And until next time, thanks for watching.